We're back with Bloomberg's Fast Forward, and I'm Lisa Murphy. Well, the Wisconsin State Senate voted for a modified version of Governor Walker's budget repair bill yesterday, and the Assembly may hold a final vote today on a bill curbing collective bargaining for most government workers. In today's State of the Union segment, we are exploring the impact of unions on the U.S. economy. Our roundtable guests are both in Washington, D.C. Dan Mitchell is a senior fellow at the Cato Institute and a former economist for the Senate Finance Committee. And Gary Burtless is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and a former Labor Department economist. Welcome to both of you, Gary, Dan. Great to have you both on the show. You know, and I'm going to kick it off with a real simple question. Let's start with the private sector unions. We've been talking about a lot about public sector unions, but do the private sector unions help companies' bottom lines, and are they adding to productivity? And I guess, Gary, why don't we start with you?
Well, they certainly can hurt companies' bottom lines, especially if there are non-union competitors in the same industry. But there is very little doubt, based on a lot of historical evidence, that they boost productivity of workers. And the reason for that is, since they tend to boost the pay and compensation received by private sector workers who have modest skills, in order to make up for the higher cost, employers have to do something like reorganize work or improve the capital that workers are using in order to produce things. So on average, unionized firms tend to have higher productivity than non-unionized firms.
Dan, let me get you to respond to that, because it seems a little backwards when you put companies in a bad situation with a unionized workforce so that they have to make the workers more productive. Do you agree with that?
I think there's a lot to that. If you have a very expensive workforce, you better make sure to figure out some way to get a lot of output from them. Otherwise, you go out of business. But I think historically, Gary is right. Going forward, and of course today, I'm not so sure about that, because there's a lot of troubles in terms of the work rules. If you look at the troubles with the UAW, for instance, it's not so much that they're getting paid more than workers at Toyota or Honda. Or, there's a little bit of that. But it's the fact that per hour worked, how many cars are being produced. And there is some evidence that, at least in some industries, the work rules have become very inefficient and bureaucratic.
Now, that productivity gain, if it exists, does that compensate for the additional cost that they have in keeping those employees? Does it make a company's bottom line actually look better, a U.S. company more competitive than, say, a foreign company? And, you know, I'll turn back to you, Gary, to answer that.
It doesn't usually. Unions have been most successful in industries that are either monopolies or are oligopolies. And so there's a lot of inherent profitability that can be divided between the workers on the one hand and the employers on the other. Unions are a way for the workers to get a bigger chunk of the total inherent profit in this oligopolistic or monopolistic kind of industry. Where there's pure competition, what unions tend to do is just change the mix of compensation so that it contains elements that the workers are in favor of, and they like things like job protection, they like vacation pay, they like health benefits, they like retirement benefits. There's very little evidence in highly competitive industries that unions get a very much better deal for their workers than they would get if they were not in a union. It's just that what they do receive is
Gary,
a mix of pay and fringe benefits that they like.
I'm going to interrupt you right there because we have to go to break. We're going to hold you over through the break. We've got Gary Burtless as well as Dan Mitchell, two opposing views on unions and their benefit or not benefit to the economy. We're going to have more with them and talk a little bit more about unions in the U.S. economy in just a moment. Stay with us on Bloomberg's Fast Forward. Well, we continue now with today's State of the Union segment on the impact of organized labor on the economy with our two guests. We've got Dan Mitchell, a senior fellow at the Cato Institute, and Gary Burtless, a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. And we left it off with you, Gary. I want to turn to Dan now and ask him, you know, Dan, does the economy, just bottom line, do unions help the U.S. economy? Does it add to our workforce? Does it make for a healthier U.S.?
There's really two questions there, public sector and private sector. In the private sector, government's job should just be to stay out and let employers and employees come to whatever agreements, fight it out, fair fight and all that. Don't put your thumb on the scales from Washington. In the public sector, though, it's an entirely different issue because, tying to what Gary was saying before the break, governments are sort of akin to a monopoly in that they're the sole provider of many goods and services. And if unions are able to use a cozy relationship with politicians to extract very generous and lavish compensation packages, then you wind up having the kinds of severe budget problems you see in California, Illinois, and, of course, the fights that we're now seeing in Wisconsin.
Gary, is that something you agree with? I mean, does the government in this case serve where public unions are concerned as that monopolistic entity?
I think it would be an empirical question. Are they paid a lot more, or do they get a lot better benefits so that their total compensation is much higher than it is in the private sector? I must say I've seen a lot of the competing studies. To me, it looks as though if you have got a lot of skills, or you've got just a modest level of skill, then probably you get a better deal working for the government than you do in the private sector. But if you've got a lot of skill, a lot of education, probably you're taking a pay sacrifice, a sacrifice of compensation to work in the public sector. So the bottom line is there's no clear-cut person who's better off or worse off. It's not clear whether you're better off in the private sector or the public sector. It depends completely on your skill, and I would say that there's very little evidence that on the whole public sector workers are extracting excess amounts from taxpayers.
10 years from now, let's fast forward. Do you think the U.S. that we will still continue to see public unions exist? Private unions have been on the wane for a long period of time. Many people say what is happening in Wisconsin marks the same thing for public unions that happened back during the Reagan era for air traffic controllers. Dan, I'll let you take the question.
I'll jump in first there. If you look at what's happened in, say, steel, shipbuilding, autos, and the private sector, clearly unions have, to some extent, killed the geese that were laying the golden eggs for workers. Now, in the public sector, it is a different animal altogether, because if you have unions as some of the biggest givers of campaign contributions working with politicians, there's not really a negotiating stance in the way there is between private sector employers and unions. And so what we're seeing is every so often, if the political pendulum swings a certain way, you have governors and state legislatures that don't want to raise taxes, and the only way you can bring government spending under control is by going after some of these generous compensation packages. And I think the evidence is that those packages are generous because the voluntary quit rates are much higher in the private sector than the government, and that's a source of data that presumably equalizes for education, skills, seniority, and things like that.
Dan, I'm going to break in there. Gary, we've got about 10 seconds. What's your answer to that? 10 years?
I think it's crucial. The critical thing is how the politics goes. If the Democrats win, unions will be in.
All right. We're going to leave it there. Thanks so much, Gary and Dan, for joining us for our State of the